is another edition of the On the Mic podcast and UFC 292 fight week coming off of Bellator 298. Plenty to talk about. So there's not many people I would rather have on the show than my good friend. I believe I can call him my good friend.
Sure you can.
One of the very best in the business, Jimmy Smith. You can hear him on Sirius XM. Sir, how are you?
Doing well, my man. Doing well. Bears fan? I see the
Yes.
Bears hat.
Yes.
Cool. Not bad.
Yes.
I got love for the Bears. I remember the 85 Bears. So, I go way back, bro. I go way back. I remember all of it, man.
Listen, before we jump into UFC 292, I do want to talk, obviously, this podcast did a lot of coverage at Bellator 298. I wanted to kind of talk to you about that because it's a hot topic. You spent a lot of time with Bellator. What do you honestly believe is going to happen following Bellator 300?
I'm hearing two more before the end of the year. That 300's not it. They're going to be two more before the end of the year, which makes sense. What people don't necessarily get about this kind of thing is you're contractually obligated to produce X number per year. There are international licensing rights or all kinds of things where you can't just stop. You can't just unless you declare bankruptcy and no one can come after you, which I don't think they're at that point. I'm hearing two more before the end of the year. So 300 isn't going to be it. I would be surprised if we saw Bellator in its current form with its current management in 2024. It seems like there's a deadline there where Viacom wants them off their books by the end of the year. The problem is, and I spoke to a potential buyer, somebody who was interested in buying them, maybe, blah, blah, and the conversation we had, one of the things he said is, I'm thinking about how long it takes to close on a house. It takes 3 months to close on a house. A company this big, the end of the year is now, basically. So, now is when this would have to happen in order for the wheels to start turning and work before the end of the year. So it's this idea that this kind of thing doesn't stop on a dime. You don't buy it like you go to 7-Eleven and buy a candy bar. I mean, there's process and due diligence and all this stuff. And that process is A, it takes a while. And B, there are a lot of cooks in the kitchen. So we'd know by this point if there was something really big, there could be some last minute Hail Mary or something, but I would say different management, different look, everything, ownership, whatever by next year. I don't think 300 is it though.
Yeah. And you had a great interview with Scott Coker on your show on Sirius XM Fight Nation channel 156. With that all being said, do you believe Scott Coker has a role in 2024?
Probably would be my best way to put it, just because he knows the product. He knows, he has a promotional experience. I don't know how long he would have that role, but it's one of those things where unless you had somebody ready to go who's ready to step into that position and do all that stuff and the nuts and bolts, remember when Strikeforce got bought by the UFC, he was, running Strikeforce as a separate entity for a little while until they absorbed it. So unless it's bought by somebody who just wants to strip the parts and take pieces of it, if there's any kind of Bellator as an entity, you'd keep Scott Coker long enough to break in somebody else or do what you need to do. So I think he has a role for at least a while. Should they get new partnership, new ownership, something like that? I don't know how long it would last. That's the question. Remember, the UFC kept him for a while and then, what did they do? They took the fighters and kind of dumped everything else. So we'll see if that's the way they go. That would be the interesting part.
I think you could kind of explain this better than I definitely can for sure. What is the difference for those who will watch this, listen to this? What is the difference between when the UFC was sold to WME and what's happening potentially with Bellator? I know there's a lot of talks about PFL, and that seems to be the way it's going. Bellator or PFL buying Bellator, but what is the biggest difference between the UFC selling for $4.2 billion and what's happening with Bellator?
The idea is WME didn't have its own structure and system and promotion, and the UFC was going to be part of that. It was buying an entire business all by itself to be run essentially the way it was run and to continue doing what it was doing under new ownership. We're new ownership. Dana White didn't go anywhere. The nuts and bolts didn't go anywhere. The top people didn't go anywhere. They were buying it as a unit. If PFL buys it, they already have that stuff. They already have they already have production people and cameramen and directors and commentators, and they don't need the nuts and bolts of what Bellator has. They would like the fighters, I'm sure. It's much more akin to the UFC buying Strikeforce, where the UFC already had everything they needed. Boy, but we'd really like Jacare and Luke Rockhold and DC and, Alistair Overeem and those guys. So if it's PFL, as somebody who worked in Bellator and loves Bellator and loves a lot of the people there, I would love it if they kept Bellator maybe as a separate entity and set up like a yearly Bellator PFL, showdown, a yearly pay-per-view where the top guys from PFL take on the top guys in Bellator or something like that, where they would keep it as some kind of unit, because they do make great television. They do have a great roster. They're probably the best roster they've ever had. So I would like them to stay as a separate unit. That might be wishful thinking. So that's the real difference. Is PFL already has in place their own production, their own people. They don't need the structure that comes with Bellator. WME bought the whole thing, UFC piecemeal. They needed, wholesale. They didn't need just a part of UFC. They needed all of it. PFL doesn't need all of it. They want the fighters. And then what they do structurally with all that extra talent, that is the huge question. And another thing too, and I've been very vocal about this, I think Bellator's roster is damn good. I think their champs are probably the best they've ever been. So there's also the issue of who would be most nervous in this instance. If I were a mid-level PFL guy, I'd be real nervous because Bellator, brings in so much talent. And I mean, there are some top PFL guys that aren't going to be able to compete against those guys. So what about a mid-level guy who's just trying to break in, or, kind of in the mid-level in the roster? They're going to have to purge a lot of their roster to make room for Bellator talent. And, heads roll. That's the way it goes. So that's another thing too. If I'm in PFL and I'm not one of their champs or one of their headliners, I'm getting real nervous right now because a bunch of talent's going to come in and they're really good and really deep right now in Bellator.
Yeah, and Brendan Ward said that last week. He said, "Who wouldn't want our roster right now?" And he's one of many on that roster that I know PFL would love to have. Last one on this, I think the most successful recipe for a merger between the two would be if you want to do, as we see Bellator has, the World Grand Prix going on already. If you want to continue to have a tournament style each year, a season, if you will, as they call it in the PFL, have that separate, like you said, have that separate and have Bellator and PFL kind of put on more events and then specifically tournament only events. I think that's a way you can keep a roster that big. You can keep them active. You can keep them busy. Because I don't have to tell you, obviously the UFC puts on shows every freaking week.
It's not a lot of oxygen.
Yeah. And for Bellator, you talk to some fighters, they just want to be more active. And with Bellator not putting on enough events, I think if you merge the two, you have a big enough roster and two different style of events you could put on between the two promotions.
Yeah, but what you got to figure out is how to use a pay-per-view business model. You got to figure out, so what, does this lead to one or two big events a year that we can make big money on? That's the issue. So one thing the UFC has that no one else can touch outside of boxing does it. Pay-per-view business model. They have cash right there. It's just huge moneymaker. And what it allows you to do is, build up a particular, much like the WWE, where they have these tentpole, SummerSlam, WrestleMania, Money in the Bank, whatever, where they call premium live events. They don't call them pay-per-views anymore, but that leads up to these huge moneymakers. And outside of the UFC, no one's been able to cash in on the pay-per-view business model. They've tried. PFL did one last year. Here's a rule of thumb in this business. If you don't hear the numbers, they're not good. If they're not everywhere, they're not good. And, PFL never did one again. I was there when Bellator tried pay-per-view. They tried it once, never did it again. I never heard any numbers. Well, that means they weren't good. And it's one of those things where no one's been able to crack that nut of pay-per-view success outside of the UFC. And PFL/Bellator, whatever you want to call them when they merge, or if they merge or anything like that, how do you make pay-per-view money? Is it a tournament and the winners face one another, right? Or however it is, Bellator versus PFL, something to get people excited. That's not easy to do when the UFC has an event every weekend. It's very difficult.
Very difficult. And I did say that was my last one on it, but I've got one more.
It's your time, Mike. I give you my time. You have it. What you ask is up to you, man. I appreciate
that. With all that being said, let's say Bellator did join up and merge with PFL, and PFL has the deal with the Zone, but they're also on ESPN. We quite possibly could have all the statewide MMA top promotions on ESPN and ESPN Plus. How big is that just for the sport in itself?
It's big. It is. But you start going, how is there room to promote everybody under one brand? You know, ESPN only has so much bandwidth as far as promotion and who to push and what to look at. It could be they're loading up talent for when the UFC deal is up. And if UFC says we want, X, and we go, no, we already have PFL and Bellator, you're gonna have to come down on your price, whatever. It's the same thing. When I was with Bellator, what they did on Spike, where UFC left and they looked for, and they still had rights to air certain UFC broadcasts, right? So they aired old fights and stuff while they were getting Bellator ready to go. And so they were able to have this like kind of seamless transition from UFC to Bellator. Same kind of thing where if ESPN's thinking ahead to a time when the UFC may not be there or may ask for too much money or whatever the deal is, or, the UFC has said that, or WME has said that it might be one of those things like the NFL, where it's on a bunch of different platforms and you go from it's UFC on CBS and UFC on NBC and UFC here and UFC there, where they're on multiple platforms. So that's when ESPN would need some kind of other content for MMA. That's all a possibility. You got to look at everything.
Well, speaking of pay-per-view, it's in radio, as you know, they call that a transition.
Very good. You've learned a lot, Mike.
When I work with you, it's very easy to learn. UFC 292 is this weekend, and a lot of people have titled Aljamain Sterling as and labeled him as the GOAT of the bantamweight division as champion, and he'll take on Sugar Sean O'Malley. A lot of names throughout that bantamweight division history. Dominic Cruz, probably one of the biggest ones up there. So many others. But when you look at Aljamain Sterling, is it without question he's the best bantamweight of all time?
There's always a question. This is MMA. Everybody's got an opinion about something. He's number one to me. The thing about Dominic Cruz is what makes him stand out is what hurt him. He was always injured, and he was always coming back from these big layoffs. And so people go, man, who could come back from a layoff like that and be successful? He's an all-time great. But he also didn't have the run of title defenses that make greatness, because he was always coming back from some devastating injuries, just years off and years off. And would come back and win. But he would also not have the run that really makes all-time greatness. That's why Aljo has the most consecutive bantamweight title defenses with 3. That's not a lot, but Cruz was always in and out of the division with injuries. So the one thing that made you go, wow, about Dominic Cruz was his ability to come back from injuries. But the one thing is, why isn't he the best? Is, well, he was never healthy long enough to have a real run at 135 pounds, right? So right now I put Aljo first, which is really extraordinary if you think about it, because he was not one of these guys who came in with like a sense of destiny. Like Israel Adesanya was like, dude, this kid's special. This kid's going to be great. He kind of like crept up on everybody. We just kept winning and winning and winning. And now it's 9. And you went, Jesus, you're kind of looking around like, Jesus, kid could be champion. And then he was able to do it. Of course, the first and only to win by disqualification, to win a belt by disqualification. It's not his fault. It's Petr Yan's fault. And then he wins the rematch. Then he beats TJ Dillashaw. And then he beats Henderson. And you kind of, it was just one of those champs that kind of snuck up on you and ended up being great. I think he beats Sugar Sean O'Malley, especially if he does it in dominant fashion. I think the consensus gets a lot stronger about him being number one.
I just want to play devil's advocate for sake of conversation. If you look at, how he got
Don't mess with me, Mike. You know what happens, bro.
Well, I
mean, argue with you a little bit. You know what happens, Mike? You know what happens, bro. You know what happens. Go ahead.
I know what happens, and I'm not taking anything away from Aljamain Sterling. Yes. He's one of my favorite. But like you said, he got the belt off disqualification, then a split decision, then he beat a injured TJ Dillashaw and a returning Henry Cejudo. There will be those people that say that. There will also be those people who say, well, Sugar Sean, as Aljo has said this week, people are going to say Sean O'Malley wasn't ready for me if I go in and beat him. So how can Aljo kind of silence all of that and go, listen, I'm just beating who's put in front of me?
By doing that. I mean, the problem is he gets wrapped up in, I need to blow this guy away. Dude, Sugar Sean's dangerous. He's dangerous. And the idea of, all right, I need to dominate this guy to prove my legacy. Nope. Hey, dude, just win. Just get out there and win. And it's one of the things that hurts Aljo is when I look at my Mount Rushmore of MMA, and right now it's John Jones, Anderson Silva, GSP, and Amanda Nunes are probably my top 4. The reason GSP isn't number 1, or why I put him like 3rd or whatever I do, he didn't have a lot of wow factor, right? He left the UFC on 7 decisions in a row. Now, he did have wow factor earlier in his career, right? He would blow guys out of the water, and then he became a decision machine. Aljo doesn't have the wow factor we generally like out of all-time greats, right? Like a Jose Aldo, who's like back in the day, you're like, oh my God, he's just, lighting guys up. Aljo didn't really do that. As you said, he tends to win by decision. He tends to get it done however he needs to. That tends to be on the ground. That tends to be in long, difficult, grueling fights. He doesn't have that wow factor. He's almost like an, oh yeah factor. Like, oh yeah, he did beat so-and-so. Oh yeah, he is 1-9 in a row. Oh yeah, this is 10 in a row. Like just that consistency that we pretend to reward in MMA, but we really don't. Not enough people go, Jesus Christ, this guy's not lost in how long? No, it's oh my God, that flying knee, or oh my God, the Joaquin Buckleys of the world that, give us these highlights, but Joaquin Buckley's not, right now a great welterweight or anything like that. So we tend to disregard the consistency, which I think is the hardest thing in MMA, is to like do it consistently time after time after time. And Aljo's just consistent, but he doesn't have that wow factor, as you pointed out, that makes people go, wow, what an amazing. He's not the usually the water cooler talk Monday afterward.
Yeah, I think someone you mentioned, right? The best comparison would be in Israel Adesanya. He's getting a lot of his finishes in his title reigns, and that's the guy everyone's talking
when
about.
He does finish, it's like, oh my God,
Right.
But then he has these stretches where he's kind of, wins by decision, right? But you remember the big ones, you remember the biggies, and that's how you remember it, man.
And that's the danger of Sean O'Malley, because he has those wow factor after wow factor after wow factor. He has the confidence. Aljamain Sterling would go as far to say he has the Dana White privilege. How did we land here with Sugar Sean? And I know you said you have Aljo winning, but how did we get here with Sugar Sean O'Malley?
Stardom is its own thing. It's its own thing. It's hard to even like put your finger on. You're like, why does this Nick Diaz, what I always point out is Nick Diaz quit against Robbie Lawler in a fight where he wasn't getting killed, and they're chanting Diaz. Most fighters get trash thrown at them. You quit in the middle of a fight for no reason. It's just, he's a star, and so that has its privileges, right? Oh, I hate fighters who make excuses. Nate makes a ton of excuses. Every time he loses, he found a way that he won. It's like, but he's a star, therefore he gets over. And Sugar Sean's got that. And I interviewed him what was Tuesday of this week. He gave me a really good interview on Sirius XM, and he's like, dude, I changed my hair color, and it was the biggest story of the fucking. He's almost like, I don't know, like, you know what I mean? Like, dude, I don't, I just fucking changed my hair color and became the biggest story. I'm like, all right, how about I wear sunglasses? I wore sunglasses. Oh my God, he wore sunglasses the whole time. He's almost like, Jimmy, I don't know, but whatever it is, I got it, and I'm not a fool, and I'm going to use it. It's like, I didn't ask for this, but shit, did I get fast tracked? Yeah. Did I have to beat everybody else beat? No. He's beaten one guy who is still in the UFC, Petr Yan. No one else he beat is on the UFC's roster. They all got cut because they weren't very good. Or they weren't, they may have been okay at one point, but by the time he got them, they were nothing. And what I love about Sugar Sean, we talked to him, is like, he doesn't talk like he's, his shit don't stink. He's like, hey, dude, if they're going to give it to me, I'm going to take it. Hey, right. Do you want to fight for the title? Yeah, sure. Why not? So he understands that kind of stardom has its privileges. And if you're Dana White, it's not your job. And I've said this many times about Dana White. It's not his job to tell us what to like. If they like it, give it to them. All right, here, fine. He said, we put up, it was Paddy Pimblett he was talking about one time. He goes, Paddy Pimblett's weigh-in, like 1 million people watched his weigh-in. The next highest on that card was like 200,000. He's like, all right, apparently you like Paddy Pimblett. Okay, here's more Paddy Pimblett. Like, I don't understand the fucking appeal, but that's not my job as a promoter to understand it. My job is to, okay, fine. You want, what I tell people is fighting is a buffet. Whatever you eat more of, that's what they're going to bring out of the back, right? They keep eating the sausage. Okay, bring out more fucking sausage. You have a choice of everything. And whatever you eat, that's what they're going to give you more of in entertainment. They're going to give you more of whatever you ate a lot of. And, Dana White doesn't make stars. He recognized what a star is, and he gives you more of it. Same thing when I was in the WWE. Hey, LA Knight right now is like super over. It's like, okay, fine. Give him more LA Knight. I don't know, And that's what they do, and it's worked out so far. But he's very understanding of like, yeah, dude, people like me, so I keep going. It's pretty simple.
We have a second title fight on this card: Zhang Weili against Amanda Lemos. Obviously, I think it doesn't take a genius to realize this isn't the most stacked card. I think we all are
Right.
anticipating a huge card in November. There's also one coming up next month I want to get your thoughts on. But this title fight for the UFC Strawweight Championship, how do you see this fight playing out?
If Zhang Weili doesn't fight like she's invulnerable, she should win. Amanda Lemos is a great finisher. Like rarely at 115 you see a great finisher. 13 wins. She's finished 11 opponents. It's a really high finish rate for these weight classes. 25, 15, right? But around Zhang Weili tends to fight like her chin's titanium, right? We saw it in the first Joanna and Jacek fight where it was like, oh my God, you can move your head, right? Like it was just, she was just willing to go out and bang, bang, bang. When she lost to Rose Namajunas, that switch kick, head kick knockout, she just comes forward like, I can take anything, and it can be to her detriment. And I think that might be the key if you're Amanda Lemos. Like if I'm her corner, I tell her, hey, at some point she's going to drop those hands and she's going to come forward like she can't be knocked out. That's when we get her. I don't care. Might lose round number 1, might lose round number 2. She's going to let that chin hang out when she gets confident. And that's when we take her. And so that's kind of the issue is she's taking on another great finisher at one, and she's a great finisher herself, by the way. She's taking on another great finisher at 115. So if you're betting on Lemos, you're not betting on her to win rounds. You're betting on her to capitalize on a mistake, much like Alexa Grasso, Valentina Shevchenko. That's what you're really looking at.
Yeah, it should be a great fight. This man said he's carrying the card, which maybe there's a sake of conversation, and that's Ian Gary. Obviously, he's got a last minute opponent change, going from Jeff Neal to now Neil Magny. I mean, listen, it's not Connor in the middle of a card, but it is Ian Gary. He does have that Irish background, but he also is undefeated, and he's taking on a big veteran here in Neil Magny. Is Ian Gary carrying the UFC 292 pay-per-view card?
No. Sugar Sean, I think, is carrying this
Right.
a bit. If you weren't on the same card as Sugar Sean, maybe you get away with that. But yeah, Ian Gary is one of those potential stars, undefeated. But Neil Magny is 6'3", just as tall as Ian Gary. Ian Gary's used to kind of having the height advantage. He's not going to have that against Neil Magny. He's awkward. He's weird. He's a veteran. He knows every trick. He holds basically every longevity record at welterweight is Neil Magny, like most fights and most octagon time, and like everything that's just like you stick around long enough, you get all these records. He's one of those guys. He's got like every record at 170. And he's a tough nut to crack. Now it's late notice. He's been up and down in his last few fights. He hasn't been, fantastic. It's a perfect opponent. It's okay. Let's see if you can beat a real seasoned veteran, but not under the best circumstances in the world, right? Like he's coming in late. He hasn't done great in his last few fights. So there's that name value of Neil Magny, but this isn't the Neil Magny who, had the comeback against Hector Lombard. It was a long time ago. It's a different kind of guy, and he's had his issues. So this is the perfect opportunity for Ian Gary to say, hey, I'm carrying this card and I'm going to whoop ass and take that next jump up. Because when you look at his record, he hasn't fought anybody worth farting and Windstorm. And like, okay, they're tough guys, like they're decent, but he hasn't fought that name. So there comes that time when you're undefeated, you got to fight the name. This is the time for Ian Gary.
It should be a good one. And last one on this before I get your thoughts on a couple things in September. Your colleague, Chris Weidman, Won't Back Down Radio on Sirius XM. He returns just from a standpoint of who Chris Weidman is and what he's done for the sport and what he's done with the UFC. What does this return signify for, Chris Weidman and just coming back from that brutal injury, coming back against Brad Tavares? Yeah,
the will to come back is really it. I don't know how it works out for him. We generally haven't seen people come back from this injury and do well. Right? Anderson Silva was never the same guy. We don't know about Conor McGregor. Your shin snaps like a dry twig. It's really difficult to come back from that. And then I had a really interesting conversation with Eve Edwards. He's my pay-per-view guy, right? And I interviewed him on Sirius XM, and we talked one time about Santiago Ponzinibbio, who had to take time off from a knee injury, came back, wasn't the same dude, hasn't been the same dude since. And we talked about the injury, and Eve said something really brilliant. He goes, dude, he was out for 2 years. That's forever in MMA years. Like the game just moves past you. Like you took 2 years off to rehab an injury. You come back and it's like, oh crap. Like they're so much better than they were when I left. It isn't just your injury and you, and it's the sport is a freight train. And if you don't catch up, man, it'll go right past you. And that's another thing is Weidman is an old school guy. I mean, think about how many people he fought on the way up who aren't around anymore. You know, they aren't in the sport anymore. And he's you turn around and you're a dinosaur, right? You're a throwback. You're an old school guy and all this stuff. And that's what this signifies, is an old school guy trying to come back and do something against Brad Tavares, who's just a solid middleweight. I don't think he was ever, great by my definition, but solid, strong, comes forward very well, hits hard, has been in some very tough fights. So it signifies how far a guy can come back mentally and physically. I think that's the symbolism of the comeback of Chris Weidman.
Should be a great card, and I think they put some of the best names on that card for their return to Boston. They'll be making their return. They being the UFC at UFC 293. They'll be going back down to Australia. Two things real quick here. One, I believe, I'm not sure if it's official yet, but I know the rumor is Laura Sanko will be on that pay-per-view call. Don't quote me on that. But even if things change, how happy are you to see how great Laura Sanko is thriving in this sport?
I've known Laura for a long time, and she contacted me when she was just getting started in commentary and ring announcing, all that stuff. She like sent me a message, "Hey, can we get together?" When I lived in LA, and can I just talk to you? Oh yeah, sure. We met at a coffee shop in LA. I was like, "Hey, how you doing?" Very nice. I'm Laura. I'm Jimmy. It's very nice to meet you. Sat down and she kind of picked my brain about interviews and what to do and all this stuff. And she was so like, I just want to do well. And I just want to make it. And I said, hey, yeah, you'll be fine. And to see her go from that to where she is now is great. It's awesome. And she's paid her dues. She's worked her way up. She does her research. She does her prep. She spends her time working hard. We called a couple of Invictus together. She's a lot of fun. She's a great person. And it's great to see her do what she's been able to do. And I can't wait to see her actually get a chance on a pay-per-view card. That'd be awesome.
Yeah, I think that would be great. That pay-per-view being headlined currently, Israel Adesanya, Sean Strickland. We got to the fight. I mean, listen, we know Izzy's not going to hold back. We definitely know Sean Strickland's not going to hold back. This isn't Conor and Khabib trash talk, but this could get very ugly. How do you think the promotional side of UFC 293 will go? And do you think the UFC will be mindful to be like, I know Dana White always says, listen, it's the fight game. What do you want me to do? But maybe be a little mindful of this one?
I guess it's hard to, Izzy came out and publicly said something I said on my show, which is, hey, man, do you really want a belt on this guy? Do you really want a belt on Sean Strickland, who said women should go back to the kitchen and, we're not making money because women are working? Like stuff that is just dumb. Just it's dumb, and it just gets people talking about me. ESPN doesn't like that shit. Disney doesn't like that shit. We all have our masters. And, I wouldn't be surprised if ESPN went, we don't want that guy on our air. Like, hey, wake up. We don't want this guy, saying this kind of shit on our platform. We don't need it. And so that is the issue. Is Dana can say like, oh, I don't care. Dude, ESPN and Disney, they care. When he tried to do a show in California during COVID on an Indian reservation, and the governor goes, no way. I mean, you hit a ceiling where it's like, oh yeah, okay. When the governor calls Disney and goes, this ain't happening, and Disney calls you and goes, cut this shit out, it's that kind of thing. We don't want a guy who's says things that are stupid for attention, and on our air. We don't like it. You know what I mean? And that's the issue. And now the thing is that Strickland is tailor-made for Israel Adesanya to knock out. Like he tends to walk forward. He doesn't make the best decisions in fights. Tends to put physical pressure, meaning he's always there to be hit. So he's almost tailor-made for Israel Adesanya. So I don't think there's a huge risk. But if Dana is ever going to have a conversation with somebody about, hey, cut it out, it would be Sean Strickland.
It'll definitely be interesting. Jimmy, you're always great with your time. Before I have you promote your show and everything, I've got one bonus question here for you, because he'll be on the podcast later today as well. As you know, obviously, and I've been saying it a bunch on social. I spent last week in Bellator. For the first time ever, I'll have Burt Watson on the podcast later today. Do you have a favorite Burt Watson moment?
Oh my God. You know what? I don't think I do personally. He's a guy I've had interactions with because his business just is small. You know what I mean? But yeah, I've heard a lot of stories secondhand that I will not get into because of confidentiality concerns. I don't like to out people, but secondhand, I've heard a million. Personally, I've had nothing but great interactions.
He's a great guy. And so are you. Jimmy Smith, Unlocking the Cage, 2 to 5 Eastern on Sirius XM Fight Nation, channel 156, Monday through Friday, ESPN Fight Camp. What else do you have going on, Jim?
Oh, man, I got Combate every Saturday from Miami. You can check that out on Paramount Plus, man. A lot of fun. It's the live fights I'm calling. So I got a full schedule, man. Full schedule.
And the fact you made more than enough time for me today really means a lot to me. All the best. I'm sure we'll talk soon. Enjoy the fights this weekend.
Always, Robot Mike.